I'm Glenn Campbell of Demographic Doom, talking about the next recession and why it's going to be a doozy. Now, the fact that a recession is coming is not news. There have been recessions throughout economic history. There has been a boom and bust cycle for as long as there has been an economy. And this is quite simple. It's because people during the boom times get greedy and get overly optimistic, and they overextend themselves, and they invest in things they shouldn't be investing in, and they bid up assets to the point where those assets have to eventually crash. And this is bound to happen because it's been a while since we've had a recession, since 2008. And so one is coming. You can't say when it's going to come or how it's going to arrive, but a recession is coming. My argument here is this could be the worst recession in any of our lifetimes. This could be the equivalent of the Great Depression. And the reason is twofold. One is debt. Debt levels have risen to the highest in history. And demography and demographics, the fact that the population that we have now can't support the growth that we have known in the past. So there was a crisis in 2008. The banking system nearly failed. The central banks rescued the banking system by pumping a lot of money into the economy and lowering interest rates. That spurred more investment, but it really spurred a bigger set of bubbles because investors took all this free money and used it to bid up the value of assets. So things like the stock market are vastly overvalued because of all this free money available that pushed up the value of assets. So our debt problems turned into an asset bubble, and at some point that's all going to collapse. It's all going to crack. So let's talk about debt. The Institute of International Finance has added up all the debt of the world and says that the debt of the world is 320% of GDP. If you have an income of $10,000 a year, you owe $32,000 in debt. And you may think that, well, that means you can pay off your debt in 3.5 years, but that's not true because most of your income, that $10,000, has to go to your living expenses. It's not accessible for debt repayment. And the whole world is operating on that basis. The governments are operating on that basis, that they have more debt than they can possibly pay back. And if everybody in the world has more debt than they can pay back, at some point that debt has to crash. There has to be a default on that debt at some point in history. If you have more debt than you can repay, then at some point there has to be a default. So if you have huge unsustainable debt, you're eventually going to have a huge default. And default means that debtors don't pay the money they owe, which is great for the debtors. It's not great for the people who hold the debt. In other words, if you owe money to somebody, that other person sees that money as an asset, as money in the bank. So if you don't pay that debt, then some other person has to lose their money. And in the modern world, that means investors, and that means investors like people who've saved for retirement. If there's a massive debt default, then retirees are going to lose their nest egg one way or another because their nest egg is invested in some way in the world's debt. If you were invested in a money market account, you were invested in bonds, and there's the possibility that those bonds might go belly up, that whoever has issued the bonds may not make good on them. Probably the best symbol of the insanity of our current system is negative interest rates. The fact that you can loan money to the German government for 30 years, and at the end of that 30 years, the German government will pay you back less than what you loan to them. That is negative interest rates, and that is insane. The reason it's insane is that in 30 years, you don't even know if the German government is going to be around. There's a risk involved in loaning money to anybody, and that risk is usually embodied in the interest rate. The risk that someone might not pay is reflected in a higher interest rate. Yet the world today thinks that all debt is good, especially government debt, and it's willing to lend money to certain governments for negative interest rates. So that is the beginning of the end, the beginning of the great collapse. And I can't tell you when or how this collapse will happen. It's just that with all this debt sloshing around in the world, something has to break. This recession is worse than the last recession because the last recession in 2008 really wasn't resolved. We had a banking crisis, and the central banks and the big governments responded to this banking crisis by rescuing everybody, by lowering interest rates and injecting a lot of money into the economy. So it's essentially a stopgap measure, a Band-Aid on the recession that revived the economy, but at huge costs. The underlying problem of all this debt was never really solved. It was just pushed off into the future. So at some point in the future, we have to pay that bill. We have to default on our debt and suffer all the consequences of that default, which is a lot of investors losing a lot of money, and maybe social systems and governments and banking systems collapsing. There could be a lot of bad things happening. So where does demographics come into this? Well, demographics dictates the number of human bodies in a country. And this is a bounding condition of how big the economy can be. So a country that has 10 million workers is a bigger economy than a country that has 5 million workers. And if the population falls, then ultimately your economy has to fall because the economy is generated by people. Now, some people may say, well, technology will save us. The robots will take up the slack of the missing workers. The trouble with that argument is robots don't pay taxes. Individual workers pay taxes. And most governments, like the U.S. government, they depend largely on taxes on workers. So if the number of workers falls and the productivity, that is the amount of taxes that those workers pay, doesn't rise per worker, then ultimately the government is going to make less in taxes over time if the population falls. And that means that the government can't pay its humongous debt, which is issued on the assumption that the economy is always going to grow. If the debt of the government grows faster than the economy grows, then ultimately there has to be a government default where the government can't pay its lenders. Yet the bond market hasn't realized this. People are willing to loan money to the government for 20 years for virtually no interest. And this is utterly insane. And this is a reflection of all the money that central banks pumped into the economy during the 2008 crisis. The other way that demographics affect the future economy is that it changes the profile of spending. For example, if your economy has a lot of old people, it has a different spending profile than if it has a lot of young people. If you have a high proportion of old people to workers, you have a big problem because the old people are sucking up government resources faster than the younger workers are paying into the system. So what this means, now the demography is not going to cause the next recession. The next recession is going to be caused by excess debt. But demography is going to assure that this recession is going to go on for a very long time because there is this underlying problem of too many old people and not enough workers. So this is going to keep the recession, keep the downturn going. It's going to mean that the bad times that come are going to last for a very long time. And ultimately, we're not going to get out of them in the conventional way. We can't fight the fact that there are fewer babies in the world, and that means more old people in the world. And as the number of old people gets bigger and bigger and the workforce shrinks, this is going to result in a permanent downturn, sort of like what's being experienced in Japan right now. They have an ever-shrinking workforce, an ever-growing force of old people taking up resources, and this results in a permanent downturn, a permanent recession in Japan. And now the rest of the world is going to experience the same thing. So what does this mean in practice? It means that a lot of really bad times are coming, that we right now will look back on this era, the first few years of the 21st century, as our golden period when things were as good as they're ever going to get. From this point on, things are going to be bad, and this is going to bring down governments. It's going to bring down banking systems. It's going to totally restructure the way we see ourselves and the way we conduct our business. And this is not all bad. Humanity should restructure itself every now and then. Every now and then, humanity needs a forest fire to clear out the brush, and this is going to be a big-ass forest fire coming down the line. What I can't tell you is exactly when the forest fire is going to hit, or exactly what the spark will be that sets off the forest fire. I can only tell you that the forest is tinder dry, and it's primed, it's ready to explode as soon as some spark sets it off.